Uh, Good evening once more. Welcome again. This is Kenya Data Platform User Group. Uh, my name is Dennis Washira. I'm a computer science student from Kenyatta University and also a Gold Microsoft Run Student Ambassador. If you are joining this meeting for the first time, you can follow me on LinkedIn and X as Dennis Washira and Dennis Washira _ And can always have our playlist of this series on my YouTube channel, which is at Code with Dennis. Then, as traditional, we always urge you to adhere to our code of conduct, respect others and their opinions, use an inclusive language. Also, a constructive feedback makes everyone better. Also, create an environment where everyone feels comfortable to ask any question or to have a word of comment or feedback. Welcome to TypeScript 101 series. This is event number 8. We have been doing this for the last 1.5 month, starting from the basics of TypeScript, and up to now. Today, we want to learn a concept that is commonly used in most of programming languages in this today, which is asynchronous programming. And asynchronous programming, it is an essential concept that allows you to write efficient, maintainable code while managing tasks that do not complete immediately. And just a little explanation of asynchronous programming. It is a programming technique that deals with tasks that may take time to complete. More so, like network requests, we have file input output or timers. And with asynchronous programming, your application can continue executing other tasks without waiting this time-consuming task to complete, and while improving the overall performance. And the big question is why asynchronous programming matters. And in JavaScript and TypeScript, what we are talking about, the main execution trend is single threaded. So which means that it can only process one task at a time. And if your application is waiting for time-consuming task to complete, it will be unresponsive to the user inputs or other tasks. So asynchronous programming allows you to handle this task efficiently without blocking the main thread and also resulting to a more responsive application. And so that's the most important why asynchronous programming matters, because in TypeScript and JavaScript, these are scripting language. So you find mostly they are not multi-threaded like object-oriented languages. So you need something to counteract that, to avoid one task blocking other tasks to continue, or they were programmed to continue learning while waiting for time-consuming task to complete. And there are some common asynchronous patterns we'll be looking at today. And the first one is callbacks. And callbacks, as we said the other day, these are functions that are passed as a argument to another function and executed later. So these are the basic asynchronous pattern in JavaScript and TypeScript. but they can lead to a deeply nested or hard to read code when handling multiple synchronous tasks. We shall be able to see why callbacks are mostly no longer used because of this something called pyramid of doom or a callback here, where you have multiple nested loops. It comes nested callbacks. It comes to something called callback hairs. We shall look at it. And the second common asynchronous pattern, it's promises. Objects that represent the eventual completion or failure of asynchronous operation of objects that represent the eventual completion or failure of asynchronous operation resulting to a value. So promises provide a more structured and a readable way to handle asynchronous task, avoiding the callback hell issues, which we'll be talking a little bit as we go ahead. And the third asynchronous pattern we shall be checking it's async and wait. So async and wait is a sugar built on top of promises that allows you to write asynchronous code that looks like synchronous code. So async and wait makes your code more readable and easier to maintain. So it's the syntactical sugar built on top of promises. Then you can have some simple syntax of these patterns. And the first pattern we talked about was callback. So a callback, you pass a function as an argument in another function. So kindly, if you are joining the meeting, make sure to mute yourself. We have somebody by Sir Josport, so make sure to mute yourself. Thank you. Callbacks, we said it's a technique where a function is passed as a function is passed as an argument in a function, in another function, and it is executed later when the first function returns or is after it execute successfully. So this is an example where you have a function greet. It takes the two arguments, then the name variable and a callback function. Then the return type of this function is just a void. Then we have the first function, which is greet. It's just console. It's just assigning it to a row, the name you are passing. Then whatever is being returned by this function, this is what you are passing on the callback. And also now we are console logging that whatever callback received from the function. Then promises. So promises is an object that represents the eventual completion or failure of asynchronous operation and its resulting values. And a promise is seen to be in three states. The first state is the pending state. So the initial state where it's neither fulfilled nor rejected. Then we have the fulfilled operation. So the fulfilled, it is the operation completed successfully and the promise has a resulting value. Then the third state of a promise is rejected. The operation failed and the promise has a reason for that failure. So we have that on the syntax of promise. We have this constructor here. So to create a promise, you need to create to use the promise constructor, which is a new promise, then that the new single argument, which takes two arguments, which is result and reject. So dissolve and reject. So when now I want to use the promise, I just need to use now this my new created promise here, and now set it to the whatever the result of that promise, whether resolved or rejected. So as for instance, like this, we have this our promise, which is now a resolve function that is used to fulfill the promise with a value. Like now this my promise, it's using the resolve function to fulfill the promise with a value which is now just a message, like the promise was fulfilled. Then the reject function is used to reject the promise with a reason. So if I now want to handle the result of a promise, I use this syntax here. When after I have constructed my promise with the promise constructor, I can now use my promise, then use dot then to handle my results. So if I get the value of my promise, I can console the value, which means like the promise was resolved. So I can use now, make sure this part, it runs when my promise as a resolve value, which is means like the promise was resolved. And if the promise was not resolved, I can use the dot catch function to catch any error or the reason, and pass the reason why the function was rejected. Then finally, it is the method that execute regardless of the outcome. So whether the function returned dissolved or rejected, the finally block will run as normal, and just a message to say like the promise was settled. So either with the reject or the dissolve function. Then async await in TypeScript, we said it's a syntactic sugar built on top of promises that allows you to write asynchronous code that looks like a synchronous code, making it more readable and easier to maintain. Async and wait is a feature that enables you to write the asynchronous code using the syntax that resembles to synchronous code. And async and wait, it has two keywords, which is await. So the await is a keyword that is used to declare the asynchronous function, and it indicates that the function contains asynchronous code and always returns a promise. Then the await keyword is used to pause the execution of an asynchronous function until the promise is resolved or rejected. So that's why you're saying like async and wait is built on top of a promise. That's why we are saying like the await is used to pause the execution of a sync function until a promise is resolved or rejected. So if it's resolved, we have the resulting value. If it's rejected, we have the reason why the function was rejected. And it can only be used inside an async and wait. So always these async and wait must be used in an async function. An example of a async function is this. So async function, you need to use the keyword async. Then an async function always returns a promise. So this is a promise, then the generic type of that promise. For instance, like this function, it returns data type of a string. Then if you want to use now await keyword, we saying you need to have an async function to make sure you can be able to use the async and wait keyword in your coding. So for instance, like I have this function, async function, which is get users data. It gets an argument of ID. Then the functions, always remember an async function returns a promise. So this promise of data is data type void. Then we use now the try catch block. It is a ratio coding technique that is used to wrap your code in a try catch block to avoid any unnecessary errors. So under the try, this is where you hand your logic. So like the const user is a just a variable that is awaiting another function to get now to fetch the user using the ID that was passed. So we are awaiting this function to run and return something so that we can store that value on this variable. Then we are using the console log to console log that user. So if there was error during this fetching the user data, that error will always be catched by this catch block of code. So the error is passed there as on the catch block, then we are console logging that error. So then when you call the function, this is how you call the function. You pass the ID because this is what you are passing. Then if it's the ID is passed, you get the return of that user is 1. Then the data you saw using this variable, and that's how an async and await works. So always await must be used in an async function. You cannot use async without, you cannot use await without the async function in your code. And with that, we can now dive into our VS Code and have some demo on these 3 asynchronous patterns we have talked about. So it's all about callbacks, the promises, and async and wait patterns. So far, if you have any question, let me know before we dive into our VS Code. Any question up to there? Any question before we continue in our practical today? All right, so let's move on. This is my VS Code. Let me zoom out a little bit. Last time, I think we talked about generics. It was a simple concept of how you can use generics. It's a data type, but it's a data type that take any type. It is a coding technique that helps you to avoid using any data type in your code. That also removes the type safety of your TypeScript code. So on my source folder, let me create a new file, which is async programming .ts. Then I just need to have the export of this file so that I can be able to use it on my index.ts. So export this file name, which is async programming. Then it's an arrow function. Then inside my function, I just need first of all to console the async string to make sure like my file will be important file before we start coding. So inside my index.ts, I just need to import now the file. So it is async programming from this file, the root directory. So you are in the same root, start by dot slash, then the file name. Then here down, I just need to call that function, which is async programming function. Then with that, if I start my server now, npm run dev, I expect something from my file, which is just a console log, async programming. So that's what I expect if my file was important well. And you can see we have the message, which is async programming. That means our file is important successfully. So we can get started with this concept of today, which is async programming, asynchronous programming. And the first one, we talked about this asynchronous pattern, which is callback. And we said callback, it's a programming technique where you pass a function as an argument in another function. So, and the syntax of this, it's quite simple to have this this syntax here. So let me write the first example of a callback function. And the way to write this, so you just need to have the keyword function, then the name of your function. So maybe just it's a greet function that takes two arguments, the name and the callback function. So the callback function, which is an arrow function that returns void, then we open the curly braces so that we can implement our function. Remember our function, we need to type everything. So the name must be of data type string. Then the function, the return type of this function, I just need to have a return type of void. Then our callback, it's receiving greetings. So we need to pass that there. Then this greeting is of data type string. And with that, I think our function is okay to continue. Then in our function, we need now to implement the function. So our function, I just need to declare a variable greetings. These greetings is just a string that is being string interpreted with these samples. Then just a word hello, then the name that is coming from our function. So I need to use the $sign, curly braces, and pass the name from the function. So with this, now I can call back my callback function, which is now this callback function, and this callback is taking whatever our function greet is returning here. So let me now pass greetings here as the argument of my callback. Then if I want now to call you can see this is blurred because we have not called the function. So we need to call the function here down. So it's greet. Then this greet has two arguments. If you over this, you'll be able to see it expects two arguments, but got 0. So we need to pass the argument. The first argument is name. So let me pass my name as the first argument, which is Dennis. Then the second argument, it is now the callback. This is what we need to pass on my function, which is means like it's just a greetings, which is of data type string, which returns a void. So just right here, I just need now to have the comma, then I call my greetings callback function, which is greetings. Then it's an arrow function that is just console logging the message, which is console dot log message dot call, which is now the greetings. And with this now, this is what we expect. We expect now just the arrow, then the name that is being passed on the callback, which is here now, like arrow Dennis. So if you want something new, you can just add anything there, and it will just output the message in your console. So that's the first way you can use callbacks. And callbacks are most useful when calling or requesting data from an API. So I want to simulate how you can use the callbacks with a delayed time, so that we can maybe get multiple, or we can get data from an API that is far much away from us. So the second function, it's the same callback function, but with a delayed time now, with the delayed time. So I use an inbuilt function, which is set timeout, to delay my callback, so that we can just wait for that to happen. Then we call our function when the data has been fetched successfully. So for instance, I have this function fetch data. Fetch data, it just accepts a callback function as a parameter, which returns the data maybe from the API. So I need to wrap my the function, the callback function, the data that is coming from maybe an API, and maybe it's of a data type string. Then this callback function, it's a void data type. It's a void data type. Then on my implementation, I just need to console log just a message to show that maybe I'm fetching data from an API. So console.log, then just a message, maybe fetching data from an API, and just 3 dots to show like maybe it's loading. Then before we call our callback function, we need to delay that time to wait for this function to fetch this data, then pass that data into our callback function. And I can use that, I can use a set timeout function to delay the callback function when it's being called. So I use this set timeout function here, which is a callback, which also now returns whatever we want to do. So under this, now I just need to call my callback, this callback here. So callback, then the callback, I just need to maybe to say like the data was fetched successfully. So just data loaded successfully. Data loaded successfully. Then the set timeout accepts 2 arguments. So the function, then after the function, we need now to set the time. So you can see our set timeout handler accepts 2 parameters, the timeout and also the number, the argument you want to pass. So inside here, it calculates time using, I think, microseconds. So if I want 2 seconds, I just need to use 2000 microseconds to make sure like it's at 2 seconds when this callback function will be called. So the 2 seconds will allow us to wait for this function, or maybe this whatever we'll be calling from an API to get our data from our API. And after what will be done, we need now to call our callback function. So the expectation of this code, how it run, when we run this is the first thing shall run. Then after 2 seconds, maybe the data has come, then we need now to call this callback function. So let me call now my function. So fetch data, and this fetch data is just accepting a callback function, which is just the message. And this message is just console logging the message, console dot log the message. The message. So I need an arrow here to indicate. So I want you to take note of whatever is happening here. So let me comment this out before we call the function to make sure like nothing is called here, and you can see you are just getting the console log message here, the async. So when I call this function, there will be some delay when I call the now fetching the data. Then after 2 seconds, the function, the callback function is delayed. So if you want to delay like 3 or 4 seconds, you just need to update that. And if you output that fetching data, then after 4 seconds, the callback function is called, and we have now the data loaded successfully. So that's how you work around with a callback function. But we said we have something called callback hell. So callback hell, it's a one issue that is learned by nesting multiple callback function, which are hard to read, and we are dealing with these multiple asynchronous operations. So for instance, I want to have a multiple nested callback here. So I just need to copy paste the code here to demonstrate you, because so we have this function here. The function has a callback function, and the same callback function is nested. It has an if else statement. So we find like the function, it's being called in an if statement. So it's if the data is available, do this, else do this. And when I call the function, then I pass the callback function. Then the callback function is used to check some maybe the truthfulness or the faultiness. You find like your data, your code is more, it's taking more time to run and also and to read. So with it is always advisable. The callback can be useful, but also can lead to these callback errors, like where you have nested callbacks and you are able to read your code or understand your code. And in modern TypeScript and JavaScript development, it is recommended to use promises or async and wait to avoid these issues. So to my one advice, let's not use callbacks as much as possible. Let's try to use the promises and async and wait, which are more readable and easier to implement. So let's come back now to promises. So promises are so easy to implement, and they are more readable and code maintainability. So promises, and we send promises as 3 states, which is pending, fulfilled, and rejected. And when creating a promise, you use the promise constructor, which takes a single argument, the function, which is called the executor. So the executor takes the 2 arguments, which is the reject and the dissolve keyword, the function. So just a minute. Yeah, so the promise, to create a promise, you need the constructor, the promise constructor. So you just create a variable, the promise, or maybe any name to store your new promise, which is being constructed by the promise constructor, which is just you giving you the generic return type of a string. Now the executor, or the function, takes the 2 arguments, the resolve and the reject functions. So the resolve, it is used to fulfill the promise with a value. And then the resolve, the reject is used to reject the promise with a value. So with that, I can now use this, my promise here. So down here, I can use now my promise, which have been constructed by the promise constructor using the new keyword. So my promise, then I can use now the dot then to handle the results of this promise. So with this, down here, I can now use the dot then to store the value of my the resolved promise. Then the promise, I just need to console log whatever the promise resolved. It's just a console log, console.log, just a message, maybe the value, whatever the value was returned by the dissolve function. So if there was an error, the reject function will do that. And you want to handle the reject, we use now the dot then the dot catch function to catch any error with a reason why was the function rejected. So with this, we can now be able to console whatever the function rejected. So console console.log, then the reason why the function was rejected. Then we can have the dot finally. So finally, it's a function that executes of when a promise is settled. So regardless of whatever the result of my promise, whether it was resolved or rejected, the finally key function will always run to notice, to give us a notice like our promise was settled successfully. So it's also an arrow function that is just returning the message. Maybe dot log promise was settled. So this is how now you use the promises. So you use the promise constructor to create a new promise. Then you use now the executor. So the executor, the promise, to accept the 2 functions, which is resolve and reject. Then when I want to handle the result of my promise, I need to use dot then to to handle the resolve function, then .catch to reject or to execute the function when to reject the function with a reason, then finally to execute when the function, or to execute the promise regardless of whatever the resolve or the reject function was output by the promise. So let's have an example of a promise, and I can try now to change my promise. So this was just an example. Then I just want to demonstrate how promise work, and I want to do something called chaining promises. What I need to do is just a function that may be fetching user, maybe fetch a user. So fetch user. This function has a single argument, which is ID of data type number. And this function returns a promise. So I need to indicate that it returns a promise, and this promise is of data type string. That way, then I need to open my function. So under this function, I need to return something. We said our function is return string, so we need to use now the return keyword to indicate that we are returning something, and whatever you are returning, it's the new promise. So we are using the new constructor, the promise constructor, to have a new promise in our function. So I use the new keyword, then the promise. So the promise, remember we said it has two functions. So there is and reject functions. So the reject function, which is an arrow function, which is now wants to delay this functionality with a set timeout. So set timeout. This set timeout, I want it to have a functionality of just an if condition to check something. So with this, I want to check. So if the ID, so the ID we are passing here, this is what I want to use. So if the ID is equals to 1, I just want to display something, to use now the resolve. If resolve is saying like it's used to fulfill the promise. So I want to use now the resolve to fulfill. If the ID passed is 1, I now want to use now the resolve to just pass my name, like Dennis Washira. Then, so if ID is not equals to 1, let's use the else condition, the else block. If ID is not 1, that means we want to reject the promise with a reason. That means like maybe the user was not found. So here I want to use now the reject function to reject with a reason. So the reason I want to use to say is maybe the user not found. Then we say always set timeout as to argument the function and the time. So I need to pass it here like 2 seconds, like that. And then I want now to use the function to call the function fetch user. So just below my function here, I want to call the fetch user. So this fetch user, remember, it's a return type of promise. That means we need now to handle the resolve and the reject functions. So fetch user, then the parenthesis, the fetch user is indicating like we need to pass the ID. So I just need to pass the ID of my function. Then we need now to handle the two cases. So the resolve and the reject. So under my function, I just need to have just below or just here dot then. So if you use dot, you'll be able to see now the 4 function that you can perform on this fetch user, because the fetch user, it's a promise function that is returning. It's a function that is of a promise string. So if I want now to resolve my promise, I use dot then function, then the parentheses, then I just want to display the user, whatever the user was passed or the promise resolved. So just an arrow, then whatever my function, the promise is returning here, the resolved thing here. So I just need now to console log dot log, then parentheses. Let me use the backticks. User, maybe the user's name. The user's name is. I want to use the string interpolation to pass my the name from the resolved promise, which is now the user. So this is what we are getting from our function. So this then is Washira. Then I want just to return that user data there. So return just the same backtick, then users data. I just want to add something on this data. So which is the user, adjust maybe comma, he is like my age to be maybe 30. Then I need to terminate there. Then if the promise was rejected, I need to catch or to implement the dot then. I need, whenever I want to I return this, I need also to use the dot then, so that I can be able now to use the return string here. So I can also use dot then again. So this is what I'm saying, the chaining promises. So I want to chain two promises, like after returning this, I want now also to return or resolve whatever was returned by the resolve first one. So then I just need to console log whatever the users, maybe the user's data, which is just the console log the user data. So console.log .log, then the user data. Then if our promise end was rejected, so I need to handle that also. So, and to handle the rejects, we use .catch now. So .catch, maybe the errors. So the error we sent is this error here. So the reason for our error is user not found. So that's whatever, this is whatever you are console logging there now. So catch error, then equals arrow function. Then we just console log the error there, control this error here. Console.log the error. So this just making my console log message to be more understandable, like maybe async programming, then the error we are trying to console log there. Then I can now use the finally there, but I don't want to use, because the finally is a method that executes whenever the promise is set run. So regardless of whatever the function or the promise returned. So I want now to simulate this on my console log. is our function. So our function takes an argument of ID, then returns a promise. So this promise, we are constructing it from our promise constructor, which is using the new keyword, then the promise. Then our promise has two arguments, which is now the resolve and the reject function. So under the resolve and the reject, I'm just using the set timeout to check two conditions. So if the ID that we passed here, so if the ID will not be, if the ID will be 1, we want to resolve our promise with a message, which is the return, which is the Dennis Washira. If ID we passed here is not equals to 1, then the reject function will take over and reject the promise and give us the reason why the promise was rejected. When I've called the function, I have changed to resolve then. So the first, I'm just constructing the user. So the user ID, the username, which is this here, then I'm just returning the string there. Then I'm just constructing the user data, and this what I'm getting there and constructing there. So if I have an error, I use the dot catch block to have maybe to catch the error. If ID was not 1, the catch block will execute. So if you can be able to see here now, so let me comment this and then comment. So the first thing you get to know, we are getting the console log, which is user's name is Dennis, this one here. Then the return, whenever we return this, the second dot then is console logging the data, which is now user's data, this one here, which is Dennis Washira, inch 32. Then our function has passed the resolve, has used the resolve function to resolve our promise. What if I pass now anything else, maybe 2? So 2 is not equals to 1. So our function will not resolve, it will reject and have our error in our output there. So the dot catch block, it is finally executed because our function has rejected our promise with a message that our user not found. So if you are getting confused, let me just remove this message there and just construct the error. So the error is user not found. So this message here. And that's how we use, maybe you chain the promises. And finally, the last thing I want us to check is async and wait. We said async and wait is a syntactic sugar built on top of promises that allows you to write asynchronous code that looks like a synchronous code. So I want to have an example here. So let me comment this code here, and we can continue with async and await function. So async and await, we say that it uses two keyword, which is async and await, and also async must be wrapped in an async function. So take note of that. Then async function, we said async function. This is how you write an async function. So use the keyword async, then the keyword function to indicate the function, then maybe the function name fetch data. And this function maybe an async function always returns a promise. So you need to type it with the correct data type. So this promise, maybe it's returning a string. So let me use the generic string there. So string, then whatever now the code. I just want to return the string, maybe data fetched. So this function, we say the async function returns a promise, and if you want to confirm that, you can console log this function. So console.log, then fetch data. So fetch data. In your console log, you'll be able to see the function fetch data. So there is a H here. So fetch data, you can see it's a promise of an object that is just returning the string, which is the data fetched. So always remember an async function returns a promise. Then you want now to use the await keyword. Let me comment that. Then we want to use the await keyword. So how we use the keyword? Await keyword is used inside an async function to pause the execution until a promise is settled or rejected. So the value of the settled promise is then returned by await keyword or the expression. So let me have an example here. The same example we end at the top. So this one here. So let me copy this function here, which was to fetch a user. The code there. Want to save, then and comment this. So this is a promise function. So fetch user, which returns function. Remember, you want to use the await. So we need our function to make sure it's an async function. So you need to use the keyword async function there. Then async function fetch user. They return the new promise constructor, which takes the two arguments, the resolve and the reject, and a set timeout, this and this. Then a 2-second delay before the return. Then I want now to use async. You are just fetching the user. So I just want to have another function to get the user data. So what I can do, just below here, I want to have an async, also async function. This async function, I want to get now the get user data. For instance, this you are getting just the user, so the name, but the user data, we can try to add more data on that user. So get user data, then it takes an argument also ID of data type number. Then the function is an async, so it returns a promise. So promise of void data type. So it's returning nothing. And under my function, I want now to use the try catch block to ensure like everything is catched in terms of whether the function learned it was executed well, or we end some errors. So I need now to use the try catch block. It's always useful and most useful in using async and wait function. So under my try and under try, that's where your implementation goes. And if you have errors, you console log them or you catch them on the catch block. So under the try block, I want to have just a function or maybe a variable. So const user. So this user, it's assigned to what? So I want now to use the await. So await keyword. What are we awaiting? We are awaiting this fetch user to get our data. So I want now to pass this function here as an await now. So yeah, we are awaiting this function to do whatever it's doing, whatever it returns, we want to store that to this variable user. Then the fetch user is having one argument, which is ID. Then after we have awaited and we have gotten the result, we want to store that result on this user. And now we can use the user to display whatever we are waiting from our function. So console dot log and parentheses. Let me use the backtick or the string interpolation to display dynamically whatever is being stored in this variable here. So maybe users name is this user here, so which is user. So this user, whatever is being returned by our await functions. Yeah, so we are awaiting this function. Then whatever is being returned by this await, we are storing on this variable user. Then we are consoling whatever is that there. Then if there is any error, we want just to catch them on our catch block. So console.log. Then if we are trying to console the error, so not log, so it's console.error. Then the error, whatever is being catched, we want to display that way. So if I now call my function this get user, so get user data, I remember our function accepts one argument. So I want to pass now the correct ID. So we are trying to say if ID is equals to 1, do this. So I try to pass ID 1. I will get now the resolve one, the resolve promise, which is user's name is Dennis Washira, because the resolve is if ID is equals to 1, resolve this. If anything else, just reject with a reason. So if I try to pass an ID that is not on the if condition, I'll get an error. So, and the error is which is being rejected here, which is user not found, which is now being catched on this try catch block there. Then the user not found. So that's how you use now the async and await. So you may always make sure you have an async function whenever you want to use the await keyword. Await is just awaiting for another function to execute to get the result of that, then display whatever the function stored in this and console log that. With that, you can combine async and await with the promises very well. So let me show how you can combine this. So this is an example. I just want to copy paste this code here, where you have multiple promises. So I have the first promise here, which is that function that is fetching user data, which returns a promise. Then we have another function that is maybe fetching posts, then a promise. So I can combine these promises using .or under my promise constructor. So if I now have an async function, this async function has a return type of a promise. So this promise, I'm wrapping it with I want to do my implementation under a try catch block. So under try catch block, I want to receive to destructure whatever the await is doing here. So I want now to destructor the user and the post from where. So I want to await. What am I awaiting? I'm awaiting a promise, then .or. So this or, I want now to call this function here, which is here, then a comma. So I'm awaiting these two functions to execute, then whatever is being returned by this promise.or, I want to destructor that, which is users and posts. So users will be coming from this fetch user, and maybe post will be coming from this fetch post data. Then I can console log the message, the users, and also the posts. And if there is an error, maybe network error, or maybe the server is not responding, everything will be catched by this catch block and console log the error there. And if you call that, you get that we are getting undefined because we have not implemented the promise, the functions here. So that's why you are getting undefined when we call the function there. So with that, I hope you have gained something or concepts and the callbacks, the promise, and async and await asynchronous patterns that is mostly being used in today's programming techniques. So just a recap of what you have done. We have talked about the asynchronous programming, which is essential concept that allows you to write efficient and maintainable code while managing tasks that do not complete immediately. These examples are like maybe a network request or an API response, file input, output, or timers. So make use of these concepts, also the promises and async and wait patterns. So I'll be sharing the documentation where I was using to run these concepts later on. So with this, it's time now for any question or any comment or feedback as we wind up our today's session. Any question on today's session or maybe the previous session we have been having, the TypeScript 101 series? Yes, Timothy?